Hello, everyone online, and thanks for logging in. My name is Stace Maples. I'm the current interim director of the David Rumsey Map Center, where we are coming to you live today from Geo4Lib Camp. This is our first keynote speaker for Geo4Lib Camp this year. And we're really happy to have Mike Migurski here. Mike's co-creator of PlanScore.org, which he's going to talk about today. He's the head of data products for Felt.com, which is a brand new platform that we're all kind of really jazzed to be using here at Stanford for all kinds of stuff. And a former mapping team leader for Facebook, a longtime champion of open geodata and the software tools to make it. His many past roles include Remix.com, Code for America, and Stamen Design. And I myself, for years, have been using a lot of Mike's products, things like walking papers, which became field papers, and other platforms that he's worked on. What's the Facebook / Meta AI, Rapid AI. Oh yeah, we made great use of that in Haiti. It was really useful for mapping roads, and so we're really excited to have him talk about PlanScore today, which is a platform for tackling the challenge of making redistricting fair and easy to understand. They're taking redistricting plans from state legislatures and evaluating them quantitatively and cartographically. So with no more from me, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Migurski. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Stace. Everybody hear me okay? And presumably online people can hear me, hopefully. All right, let me just get rid of some buttons here on the thing. Cool. Well, Stace gave a good intro listing all these things, so I won't belabor the point. But I'm really happy to be here at Geo4Lib Camp. Other things he didn't mention was I'm actually a local. I live up in Oakland, so not too far away from here. And I've been doing a lot of this work in and around the Bay Area, and I've been really thrilled to be connected with Stace and the Rumsey Center over the years, and I'm super happy to be here talking to you all today. I've got about, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes worth of stuff. Stace mentioned that leaving plenty of time and space for questions and interruptions would probably make sense. And it's a fairly tight group. So, you know, I'll go through slides, but like if people raise hands, I'll stop and we can definitely turn it into more of a discussion thing. But aside from all the things that Stace mentioned, the thing I'm actually here to talk about that he invited me to describe was some of the work that we're doing on PlanScore.org, which is, as Stace mentioned, oops, that's not the screen. There it is. It's a nonprofit that works on maps and data, in particular around fighting partisan gerrymandering. It's something that I started with a crew of people back in 2017. And our focus is kind of in two areas. One, it's on historical data sets of past gerrymandering and partisan design of congressional and legislative districts. And then two, a new dynamic scoring service for plans that people are generating. I'm the executive director. I'm also the lead engineer. I'll talk a little bit about kind of what my colleagues work on. But generally, I wanted to talk about kind of three big topics. One is, you know, why we started it. What is the actual problem of partisan gerrymandering that this kind of tech and map product seeks to address? Two, the technology behind the service. I think my impression from talking to Stace about this group is that there's a pretty heavy like kind of tech and librarianship focus here. So I went a little bit deep on some of the kind of, you know, technical underpinnings of the thing. And then finally, the results and outcomes of the 2020 redistricting cycle and the ways in which we participated in that. But I thought I'd actually start with just really basic stuff because I don't really know like how familiar the concept of gerrymandering is to people in this audience. So I'll start at the like absolute basement level of describing it. So for those of you who are in the US, you're probably familiar with the idea that there are legislative and congressional districts that people vote in. Those lines get redrawn on a periodic basis, typically in connection with the decennial census. So about every 10 years, new population numbers come out that require the redrawing of districts. Legally, the requirement is there to make sure that districts have equal population within them. So as cities grow or shrink or people move from one place to another, a lot of times you have to rebalance those districts. But the tricky part of this is that like along with that very kind of numeric rebalancing, there's a lot of opportunities to do opportunistic or shady or improper or proper ways of drawing these lines in order to create or encourage different kinds of political outcomes. Gerrymandering is a term that dates back a couple of centuries. It's an American term, which refers to the idea of politically manipulating those boundaries in order to create unfair advantages for someone. So the kind of canonical newspaper illustration example is this set of maps, like abstract maps that are here on the right. So you can imagine that there's this kind of hypothetical state on the left there. It's got a blue party and a red party in it. And it looks like about 40% of the precincts in that state, denoted by those little squares, are like red party precincts, predominantly red voters, whatever that might mean. And then 60% of them are blue. So super naively zoomed out from this, you might say, oh, well, that you'd probably expect that if there were like 5 Congress people from this state, you would have about 3 blue party Congress people and 2 red party Congress people. However, the way in which you draw the lines shown on the right 2 maps shows that you can actually change the makeup of that congressional delegation pretty severely. So if you just draw lines horizontally, you know, those look like nice, compact, sort of good-looking districts. Maybe, you know, you imagine that that corresponds to some kind of really obvious community division within that state. Immediately what you see is that there's a really like lopsided outcome, which is that blue party has basically now won every single one of those districts. It's got 4 red precincts and 6 blue precincts in each one of them. And so in the center map, the red party has been completely locked out of any form of representation here. So that kind of like naively looks pretty fair, unfair, sorry. Yeah, haha. Careful. The right-hand map shows that you can actually get pretty crafty with maps as well. So you can actually have the balance go the other way. Let's say the red party was in charge of drawing those lines. They might get creative about how they render some of those lines, what kinds of shapes they make out of these different combinations of precincts. And you can actually lead to a situation where even though the red party has a minority of precincts in the state, they get a majority of districts. They get a majority of seats in that state. So that's gerrymandering. And this is, you know, the red party, blue party thing is obviously germane right now because we're talking about political parties and partisanship. But historically in the US, it has meant a lot of things. In the 60s and before and after, it was a really strong racial topic. So there was a lot of, especially in the South, racial gerrymandering that led to the creation of laws like the Voting Rights Act in order to ensure that some of the line drawing was not intentionally disenfranchising people. At different levels of government, like county levels and sub-state levels, you get other forms of gerrymandering. One common term you might hear about is something called prison gerrymandering, where the people who live in a prison are counted towards those population numbers, but they don't actually get to vote. And so you may get situations where lines are drawn in order to afford some group of people really outsized political influence, where they're essentially using prison inmates as like dead weight in order to bolster their numbers. So it can mean a whole lot of things. But in the context of PlanScore, we really are just talking about kind of red party, blue party stuff. So it's a pretty obvious illustration. This is kind of a 30-second guide on how you do it. You can win in a lot of different ways, but the basic mechanism of gerrymandering is so-called packing or cracking. So on the left-hand map, you can see that all those red votes have been so-called cracked. They've been broken apart so that they can't form a majority in any one of those nice rectangular districts. So they've been basically broken up and atomized. Packing is the inverse of that. So on the right-hand map, you can see that there's those 2 big C-shaped districts on the right there. Those have had all of those blue votes packed into them. So those 2 blue districts are so blue that in a way, those votes are kind of inefficiently translating into seats. You get a red advantage on that map because the red party has sort of jammed most of the blue people into 2 big super blue districts and then kind of given itself like a small advantage in all the remaining ones. So a real world example of where you'd see something like this is a lot of times you'll have, like a big kind of Republican countryside, Republican county, and then maybe a lot of Democratic voters kind of compressed into towns. And so a lot of times this is the form of packing gerrymandering that tends to happen in those states. You get like, one super strong, let's say, Austin congressperson who is just like Democratic all the way, has like a 95% majority, and then a bunch of Republican districts that still carve off chunks of quite liberal Austin, but give you a very strong Republican majority in the congressional delegation. So that's kind of the 30-second guide. I probably went over time of how you actually do gerrymandering. One thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is that the idea of gerrymandering always being about weird shaped districts is kind of a misnomer in a lot of ways. And this has really come up with a lot of the political science and legal folks that I work with. So this is a fairly famous district. I don't believe it any longer exists, but it was referred to as the Earmuffs District, Illinois 4, from the 2010 electoral cycle. And sort of, you know, from a distance, you might look at this and be like, well, that's something really hinky going on. Something is really weird. But what's actually happening here is you've got two spatially disparate, primarily Latino communities. I think it's Puerto Rican folks on one side and primarily Mexican immigrants on the other. And by joining these two communities with this kind of funky earmuffs or horseshoe shapes, you are actually able to guarantee representation for that community at the congressional level. So this is like a lot of shades of gray in this topic. It's not just about weird shapes. Definitely a lot of the online kind of discourse around gerrymandering tends to focus on funky shapes, but you can actually get some pretty subtle and powerful effects, even sticking to, you know, basic mammal shapes on maps without getting really too reptilian. One reason why partisan gerrymandering in particular has been really important over the past decades has been due to the 2010 redistricting cycle. There's a great book by David Daley called Rat Fucked, which I would recommend folks read. But it's basically a recounting of the 2010 electoral cycle in which we had a fairly strong Republican kind of anti-Obama wave of people, which was translated into legislative control in a lot of states, who then go on to draw the district plans for each of those states. So you get enough states with fairly cheap to buy legislative seats. You know, it doesn't cost a whole lot to elect a state legislator in terms of like campaign donations and advertising support. And then those are the people that are actually drawing those maps, and they're able to create maps that are extremely, in this case, in 2010's case, pro-Republican in nature. Rat Fucked is a great account of basically what that project looked like. It was probably one of the most kind of ahead of its time, geospatial, statistical, kind of technically astute political projects that people had seen up until that point. And it had just a huge downstream impact on, you know, the Obama administration, on politics in general in this country, and on what people were thinking about going into the 2020 cycle. This continued to be a really big topic over the course of the 2010s. There was a number of lawsuits. Gill v. Whitford was a really famous one, centered on the Wisconsin legislative map. And it included this amazing dissent from Justice Kagan, where she made the point that technology makes today's gerrymandering totally different from crude line drawing in the past. She pointed out how new redistricting software makes pinpoint precision when designing districts, and can lead to some of the worst partisan gerrymander on record. However, she pointed out the technology is going to get better. She thought the 2020 cycle would get worse, but when we started working on PlanScore, we thought this might be an interesting opportunity to use some of that same technology and some of those same techniques in order to perhaps shine some light on the topic, make it a little bit more easy for people to talk and think about, and maybe kind of squash the potential for one party to completely bulldoze another party. So this is the team that I work with. We've got Ruth Greenwood, who's a litigator. She currently runs the Election Science Center at Harvard University. There's a statistician, Eric McGee. He works for the state of California. Actually, a really interesting person. My first exposure to this world was literally sending him fan mail due to a Washington Post article that he co-authored. I got interested in the topic around, early 2017, as a lot of us did, and just happened to sort of find his name, caught that he was pretty local, wrote him some fan mail, and we sort of took it off from there. And then Chris Warshaw and Nick Stephanopoulos are both academics who work in this area. There's also Simon Jackman, who's an Australian, weirdly enough, who works on a lot of US political stuff off screen. And then I'm more the code and maps guy. So it was kind of a nice connection, these pretty high powered academics and political science theorists who were doing things like writing arguments for Supreme Court briefs, teaching, this topic at major universities. And I think their kind of big attraction to this was like, oh, you can build websites. That's pretty cool. So it was a really nice kind of connection to find, me, who's kind of more coming from the code, the maps, the math, the visualization world, and really a newbie to the political science world. But I was really interested in avoiding some of the common kind of, screwy map shapes tropes that I think come up in gerrymandering a lot. And these are the folks that kind of guided me through that process and eventually kind of helped turn this into a real organization with some kind of muscle behind it. So the opportunity that we took was we wanted to do something similar to walkscore.com. For those of you unfamiliar with walkscore.com, it's probably about 10 or 15 years old at this point. It was kind of an early Google Maps hack. And I think for a lot of folks, it changed some of the discourse around residential neighborhood choice, in particular for like rentals and purchases of property. All of a sudden, about 10 years ago, you started seeing like apartment listings and real estate agents saying what the walk score was of the neighborhood that they were offering a house in. Walk score is sort of a shorthand for how many like grocery stores are nearby. Is there a library within walking distance? Can you actually live in this place without having to have a car? And I thought it was hugely transformative because it, kind of attached this really simple number to a very complicated concept in urbanism that suddenly gave people a little bit of a way to like more concretely compare and contrast different types of places they might want to move into, and be able to make a choice that was informed, thanks to something that kind of boiled down some of those numbers into a good kind of like ABC, 100-point scale type thing. So we wanted to do the same thing for gerrymandering. We were thinking about two audiences in particular. One, we wanted to give political journalists better historical data to report with, so that they had a little bit more background information. So they weren't just kind of, pulling stuff out of the air, but had a little bit of a sense of like, what the background situation was in a given state when drawing its plans. And then two, we were thinking about all the people that are kind of in the game of redistricting, the line drawers, the lawyers, the people suing each other, the legislators. We wanted to give them tools so that they could actually see what the fairness of a map might look like. The historical data actually came from a lot of the work of the folks who I showed a couple of slides ago. Simon Jackman in particular has put together information for papers like this Chicago Law Review article that that Nick and Eric, two other collaborators, put together, where they looked at historical information about partisan skew. This is all data that's existed in these kind of law review articles or amicus briefs or other kinds of like, fairly dense and hard to get to documents in the past. But what we wanted to do was to make that convertible and visible and understandable to kind of lay audiences, to people that were more in that journalist camp who maybe weren't digging into, old issues of this University of Chicago Law Review, but did want to understand, like, historically, like, is this plan a good one or a bad one? Is this worse than before or better than before? So today, if you go to planscore.org, the first thing you see is essentially a distillation of all that historical data. You can choose US House, state senates, or state houses as the kind of three chamber types that this map will show. And then we've got data going back to 1972, 50 years ago, that actually gives you a bit of a sense of how these numbers and what the partisan advantage in different states looked like over that time. Not all of the states are filled in because we only track these numbers for states that have kind of enough seats in them to actually make a difference one way or the other. So a lot of those, Western states like Wyoming or Idaho, it's like, 1 seat, 2 seat kind of things. You can't really make any inferences about the overall congressional delegation. But for any of these big ones, Texas, California, North Carolina and stuff, basically any state that has like half a dozen or more delegates from it to US Congress, you can actually do statistical inferences using some of the techniques behind PlanScore. And I should also say that, like, if you actually kind of scan over this, like, you can see that one of the big historical changes has been, preceding 2010, when everything kind of got redder and more Republican. There was a long period of like 1980s era when things were decidedly up in the other direction. Much stronger kind of Democratic leaning bias, Democratic leaning skew than today. And so a lot of the kind of 2010 Republican justification was very much like, well, you guys have been, doing this to us for decades. So now it's time to kind of, give a little bit back. And where PlanScore was coming in was saying, okay, like, hold on, okay, everybody's had a turn here. Let's like actually think about like what the quantitative way to talk about this is. So it's not just like a big kind of slugfest politically. Each one of those states links into an individual state page. You can go back over different plans historically. You can look at 4 different metrics that are in the literature for gerrymandering, and kind of dig into how that plan compares to other plans that have been posted around the US. So yeah, give it a try. There's kind of views of almost every state in the union across all these different these views. And the real audience for this, again, is these political journalists, people for whom, just being told that there's a particular level of bias in a current plan isn't enough until they can put that into some kind of context. Like, is this worse than most states? Is it worse than this state historically? Is it moving right or left? What's going on with that? It's that context that PlanScore tries to historically provide. The other part of it that I mentioned is the scoring service. And this is really where the kind of meat of the PlanScore work went into. We prototyped a bunch of different ways in order to look at what future plans might conceivably look like. And what we're trying to get into here is this idea of, like, if you're drawing a plan, if you're one of these legislators or a geographer working for, let's say, Pennsylvania Republicans or somebody, and you're proposing a plan like this, probably you as a professional in that area have access to high quality demographics, really good data, research services, paid for software like Caliper and other things. And so you're working from a base of really like kind of high professionalism. What we wanted to do was to make it possible for all the kinds of things that you're doing in that role to be kind of checkable publicly. For those of you who haven't really followed the legislative redistricting process, a lot of times what it looks like is, in a state like Pennsylvania, let's say, you'll get the Republicans propose a plan, the Democrats will propose a counter plan, the lieutenant governor's office will propose something that tries to kind of balance those two, the governor's office get involved. I think in Pennsylvania during this cycle, there was something like 8 or 9 different plans all in competition at the same time. And this is happening on like a very rapid cycle basis. One of the things that we learned from talking to Ruth, who's a board member and litigator, was that a lot of times in her work, she was responding to those things, taking potentially like an entire weekend to score these things, to figure out how they would behave in a partisan way. So what we're trying to do with PlanScore with these kind of scoring concept is, can you get an answer for this in like 5 minutes or less, instead of having to do, hard math and hard geospatial work over the course of an entire weekend. Eric, who's Eric McGee, one of the co-authors and co-creators, built a nationwide district level predictive model for this. Essentially, it takes 2 kind of pieces of information. It takes presidential votes, in our case, either Clinton-Trump or Biden-Trump vote, and then it takes all of the real life outcomes at the district level for every level of state and congressional district, and uses that in order to create a kind of linear regression predictive model. The idea here is that if you hold a new election with a new plan, what's the likelihood of getting a certain kind of outcome? What are the kind of error bars and confidence intervals around it? And can you actually predict meaningfully whether it's going to perform as like very pro-Republican, pro-Democratic, pro-something else? Basically, like, what are the actual outcomes going to be like? And can you get a lot of other demographic information in there so that you as a journalist or somebody in this process are able to see basically like, well, is this thing going to run afoul of the Voting Rights Act? Is there going to be some issue with racial gerrymandering here? That kind of stuff. A lot of the model creation is really just data collection. In our case, we take some of that historical information plus purchased data sets from folks like Carl Klarner, who's an expert in electoral data. And essentially just every 2 years, whenever there's another kind of major midterm, mid-cycle election, Eric and some other folks on the team, Chris and others, will essentially regrind a new model, try to come up with a new set of predictive numbers for how that prior presidential election data predicts future legislative outcomes so that we can begin to score these things. For an end user, the ease of use is actually the thing that we prioritize. So typically what users are doing when they're interacting with PlanScore is they've got maybe a shape file locally, maybe they have what's called a block assignment file, which is really common in this world. It's a type of file that basically says, for every census block in a state, there's like 280,000 of those in a state like North Carolina, just to give you kind of a sense of density. Each one of those things might correspond to District 1, District 2, District 3. That's a very common way of representing this data. So we basically just kind of go wide, look at all the different ways in which people interact with their mapping software and mapping tools, and fundamentally make it a drag drop operation. Take your file, dump it into PlanScore, wait, ideally, 60 seconds or less, and then get some kind of meaningful output that you can use in order to gauge what the behavior or predict what the kind of outcome of that map will be. So again, this is like, 60 seconds worth of processing, which is kind of, to my sort of computer-addled brain, feels kind of slow. I'd like it to be faster. But talking to legislators and talking to their staff and talking to litigators, what they say is, oh yeah, this used to be, hours of work over a weekend, typically, because these maps would get dropped on Friday in the hopes that nobody would really dig in too far. And what we've also done is, Ruth has helped us understand, how do we optimize this information for inclusion in things like testimony, amicus briefs, to make it really legible and visible and understandable to the folks that are kind of in this game legally. I'll step you through what the actual page looks like. It starts off with charts and graphs. This was a really important design element of the site, kind of going back to this idea that just weird shapes alone aren't evidence of gerrymandering. We really wanted to focus on the partisan numbers up front before showing anything like a map. I think I actually had to kind of like make the case for showing maps pretty strongly from the beginning. Originally, our collaborators were like, no maps, maybe that's not really all that important. But we decided that actually having one would be good because it gives people kind of a sense of what's going on, or it helps them to figure out like where that line falls in relation to their neighborhood. But we wanted to push it down on the page. We wanted the partisan numbers, the efficiency gap, declination, sensitivity testing, these kind of statistical measures and links to what they mean and how to interpret them to be top of the page, really important. This is the thing that people are actually going to be arguing about. Second part of the output is the maps, and they do really come second. You can zoom in to see detail. You can check to see whether these maps are, covering your neighborhood or not covering your neighborhood in this or that district. It does have some basic kind of strong Republican, strong Democratic, or leans Republican, leans Democratic coloration on it. But one of the things we didn't want to do with these scoring pages was to get into this kind of like weird district zoology. You see a lot of these kind of comments about gerrymandering, like, oh, it's the, Sea Dragon district, or like the Donald Duck district, because the shapes are so funky. But we wanted to kind of get people's attention away from that shape and put it down kind of where it belongs, which is it's a secondary thing to the actual legislative makeup that gets elected on the strength of these maps. And then finally, every piece of output contains this really dense kind of per district information. So here you've got this, hypothetical 5 district state. In a state like, California, there'll be 55 rows here because it's got 55 Congress people. That number went down recently. Anyway, someplace in that area. But for every one of those things, you have information that people can use to try to understand, one, is this fair? Does the population actually break down to within almost even from district to district? That might be a legal requirement. 2, CVAP is short for citizen voting age population. That starts to give you a little bit of a sense of like, is somebody doing something here that's potentially unfair in some way? So you're looking at, non-Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, Asian, Hispanic, Native population. Those are all important numbers because those represent communities that want, they want to be seen in the legislative outcomes. Thinking back to that Illinois 4 district earlier, that was crafted specifically to provide Latino representation at the congressional level of the state of Illinois, because that was an important community in Chicago that otherwise would have been carved in two and essentially disenfranchised or required to, deal with like non-members of their community as the representation. So these values are all things that give you a bit of a sense of like, okay, if I dig into this, is there a weird district here? Is somebody trying something strange? Did we accidentally unbalance this? Are we incorrectly responding to the requirements of the Voting Rights Act? That kind of thing. And then there's also advanced use of this. One of the things that I think really kind of piqued my interest in that Justice Kagan opinion from earlier was this idea that like this is going to start to become not just like, a single map kind of math and technology application, but you could potentially start doing thousands of maps, generate these things. There's a lot of projects out there like this one called ALARM, the Algorithm Assisted Redistricting Methodology Project out of Harvard, which is actually using a lot of geospatial techniques in order to generate new random maps and start to make statistical inferences about them. Like, is a particular state tending to be more Republican or Democratic in its maps? Does it tend to naturally produce gerrymanders that might be racial or otherwise in manner? And do you have to make a special effort in those states in order to kind of overcome that kind of natural way that the chips may fall? So in this case, we produced an API for people like the members of the Alarm Project to be able to bulk upload maps into PlanScore. So I was saying earlier, the typical usage is somebody's dragging a map up, or they're playing with something like Dave's Redistricting application, which is a really popular online tool. And they're just kind of, they're twiddling lines and putting stuff up and testing, maybe one or two options. Chris Kenny and his team at Alarm are like, no, what if we make, 1,000 or 5,000 maps per state and score all of them? And so one of the things that PlanScore wanted to be able to do was to be able to scale up the technology so that we could handle this type of usage, in addition to the more sort of retail usage that you see from kind of more traditional line drawers. And this was a lot of fun. I'll talk a bit about the technology basis behind this in a few minutes, but basically we didn't have to do any special preparation to accommodate this. He just called and was like, hey, is it okay if I send, 200,000 maps over the weekend? And I don't know, the Amazon bill can handle it, turns out. So it didn't require any kind of like special server configuration or anything. I'll talk about some of the technology behind it. Actually, I'll talk about that now because that's my next slide. So in terms of the technology behind it, we've really learned from a lot of past projects that we didn't want to actually have persistent servers running behind this. Stace mentioned an old project of ours at Stamen called Field Papers, where one of the limiting factors of a project like that is it's running on a server someplace. You have to kind of accommodate whoever's coming to it. You have to be ready to handle whatever the maximum amount of kind of technical resource traffic is needed at any given point. And then at nighttime, when nobody's using it, you're still doing that. Like you're still paying all that money. You're still paying Amazon or whoever is your cloud vendor for kind of the compute time, regardless of whether it's not enough or far, far too much. So we went for something that was, I think, kind of newish at the time that we started, although now it's pretty old hat. It's kind of broadly quoted as serverless. You'll see it in technologies like Lambda from AWS. I'm pretty sure Google and a few of the other cloud vendors have kind of a similar idea. But the kind of gist of it essentially is if you write your code in a way that's ready to accommodate running without a server, then you can run, 1,000 copies of, let's say, a Lambda function to score a plan very, very quickly. You get billed for those 1,000 things, and then they just disappear and go away when you're done with it. And so that's been a huge advantage. I think our monthly bill these days is something on the order of double-digit numbers of dollars per month. When somebody like Chris comes at it and decides to do, 200,000 scores, then maybe it'll be like a few $100s for, just like that particular month. But it's designed to scale up and down relative to what the actual usage is. These are some illustrations just from the very first planning model that we, scoring model that we developed. I kind of went a little bit nuts with this kind of tiling concept and thinking, if you divide up a state into different tiles that are of different densities, depending on the population size, like maybe very small, highly dense tiles in a town like Richmond versus really kind of expansive, kind of loose, low population ones elsewhere, that gives you a really obvious way to kind of efficiently calculate demographics and do kind of large sums over large areas. Over time, we realized that the kind of technology that places like AWS were making available was actually catching up with us in some pretty interesting ways. And in particular, for those of you who haven't used something called PrestoDB, it's an open source database library that comes out of, I believe, originally Facebook. Although if you use something called Athena in AWS, it's the same thing, same technology behind the scenes. It essentially gives you what they call kind of query anything. So in our case, it's upload a CSV file, take advantage of the fact that Presto has very kind of post-GIS-like geospatial kind of primitives built into it. You can do basic stuff like contains within, kind of really standard like point and polygon kind of checks. And you're able to do it in a sort of SQL-like environment where it's very similar to that like kind of Lambda style scaling. Like you make a request, it requests, however many gigs of data you need to look at, gets you an answer within, 30 or 40 seconds. And then all of those resources just kind of disappear to go help somebody else on the internet after you're done. So this has been hugely transformative for us. It basically means that we don't actually have to carry any kind of infrastructure cost. We have to prepare the calculations and prepare the uploads in a way that's ready for things like Lambda and Presto. But once it's there, it means that you're essentially only paying for storage when people aren't actively using the site. So it means that we can keep the site up for like a long period of time without having to worry about, running out of budget or trying to hit people up for grants or other ways of funding it. It ends up being a really cheap thing to run long term and a really like accessible thing to run like short term when there's a really hot redistricting cycle going on. Okay, so yeah, enough with the tech stuff. I'll talk a little bit about some of the kind of the outcomes of the project, and that'll be kind of the last third of the talk. So one thing I think that's been a really interesting contrast with the 2010 cycle in 2020 has been, the 2010 cycle was very much dominated by this kind of, this red map, this submarine kind of Republican project to kind of secretly manipulate these while essentially nobody was paying attention. The 2020 cycle has been very, very different, I think, in response to that. You had organizations like VEST, short for the Voting and Election Science Team, out of the University of Florida, producing nationwide data that essentially everybody uses in order to do this work. I mentioned DRA, or Dave's Redistricting app, where essentially everyone who's in this world draws maps. Daily Kos, and in particular, Stephen Wolfe, who's one of the writers, was hugely instrumental for coverage of the topic, really, really good at kind of covering in depth different types of maps, different types of, perspective maps, and how those were kind of being argued into reality. And then 538 New York Times and a bunch of other outlets were actually really good about kind of the visibility of this issue. They were producing really excellent journalism that dug into the actual partisan effects of a lot of these maps and took advantage of, among other things, PlanScore and VEST in order to be able to do that. The results have been great. Let's see, we're done now with the 2021 cycle. There's definitely going to be, lawsuits and, kind of back and forth happening in specific states. There actually was just, I think in Alabama, a fairly major Supreme Court case that was just decided, a month ago or so. But we're sort of functionally done with the bulk of it. Every 10 years, the entire country does this for everything all together all at once, and then it turns into a place-by-place skirmish. So we're in that second part now. PlanScore scored about 350,000 maps. Most of those were for Chris, but about 100,000 of those were actually like legitimate, real, like organic kind of usage from lots of different people on the internet. We got integrated into apps like Dave's Redistricting app. They actually added a PlanScore button, and it was really easy for them to use that API to make it so if somebody's drawing a map, they can hit, PlanScore at the end and actually get one of our scoring pages as a result. There were 3 really bad maps in Ohio that were actually struck down based on expert testimony that specifically cited PlanScore. I think some of these have been kind of reanimated since then, but there was definitely kind of a nice moment when several fairly skewy, very strongly biased maps were basically being kind of struck down on mathematical grounds, which was great. North Carolina and Pennsylvania maps in particular are notably fair and have been upheld by the Supreme Court. These are 2 states, I think North Carolina especially had some really, really bad gerrymandering going on a partisan level, 2015, 2016, 2017. Like their state legislature was completely shameless and open about what they were trying to do with partisan gerrymandering, like to the point of basically saying like, hey, don't worry, like this isn't racial, like we're just partisan gerrymandering. Turns out when you say that, people read it back to you later on. But both North Carolina and Pennsylvania maps now are actually quite historically notably fair. They actually do appear to be very well balanced in relation to what you would expect from the kind of partisan landscape in each of those states. We've gotten used in testimony in places like Colorado, Oregon, California, Rhode Island, Michigan. These are all sort of like fairly hot button states. Some of them, like, Michigan or Colorado are strong kind of, red versus blue type states. In a state like California, essentially the Democrats, run the state for all intents and purposes, but there are other places where gerrymandering is important. Once you get below the kind of partisan level, you're starting to look at things like, representation for different ethnic groups or the kind of prison gerrymandering issue, that kind of stuff. And we've been cited a bunch by The Economist, New York Times, Pew Trust, a bunch of local media. So we think that the kind of raising of the issue to something that's really easy for somebody to digest by being able to look at, kind of beautifully designed maps in a browser and score new stuff actually had a fairly positive outcome this time around. In particular, we got cited in a national analysis that Nate Cohn did about the fair congressional map. One of the big stories that kind of came out of the 2020 cycle was that the whole thing actually seemed weirdly more fair than people were expecting. There was an anticipation that it was going to be a real kind of bloody knuckles fight between both sides. And I think what actually ended up happening is both kind of partisan sides ended up kind of taking up defensive positions, essentially. And so you ended up with, broadly speaking, a map that Nate believes is pretty fair, because nobody was willing to go on the full-on offensive this time around. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court cited us in a majority opinion that was upholding that fair map that I mentioned. And then more recently, the Associated Press has started to kind of think about how gerrymandering in certain places leads to problems with post-Dobbs abortion law. So that defensive position that I think got entrenched during the 2020 cycle, what that means is that broadly on a national scale, you have a US Congress that's a little bit more fair, but what you have in individual states is a congressional delegation that is absolutely lopsided. It just happens to be balanced by somebody else's lopsided delegation someplace else. So you get states like New York that are fairly democratically lopsided, and those might get balanced by a state like, you know, Missouri or Alabama that's lopsided in the other direction. But it's still not great for people who live in those places because they end up with pretty bad legal outcomes like post-Dobbs abortion law. But yeah, generally speaking, like the overall outcome has been like kind of weirdly fair-ish as a result of that. It's been a year now, I think, since this has been a really hot button issue. So in many ways, at this time, giving this talk in 2023, this is more of a retrospective than anything else. These cases are now turning into, as I mentioned, like very kind of state by state small things that might pop up as a decision here or a court case there, but not like a full press around the entire country. And then I think the really big question now is what's going to happen in the near future. What are we going to do? One, looking forward to 2030, which is, some number of years away at this point, but then also where has this kind of debate and where has a lot of the action here moved? One thing that I think has been really dismaying to me is that leading into 2020, I think a lot of us assumed that it was going to be, a fairly kind of partisan gerrymandering focused conflict. What I think has instead happened is that the conflict has actually moved into other areas of voting rights issues. And so especially in the US South and other places, you have a lot of like fairly like overt racial stuff that's happening with disenfranchisement, causing people to have to wait in longer lines, that kind of stuff. And sort of unfortunately, one of the things that I'm personally unhappy about is that I think maps and math don't really have a lot to say in that realm, or we don't really know what it has to say just yet. I think, speaking personally as somebody that got interested in this issue, I was lucky enough to have people like Eric, Ruth, Nick, and others to kind of lean on as the political scientists and legal experts that could actually kind of guide my thinking through like, think about it this way. And then here's where the sort of map and math kind of can be applied and where it'll be useful. I don't know what that looks like for actual like voting rights and election law coming up. Hopefully there's something, but that's probably one of the scarier things right now. Is that it? That's it. That's me. Thank you, everybody. How are we on time?
We're great.
Okay.
We're just right.
Okay.
You mentioned the Alabama legislative districts and the Supreme Court. Did y'all work on that at all, and were you cited in any of those briefings?
No, because I think the Alabama case was really specifically about racial gerrymandering. Like that really kind of went back down to sort of like more voting rights acts, like how many districts can actually elect an African-American representative in the state.
Right.
And I think the shocker there was that as weird as the Supreme Court is right now, they actually voted kind of what I would consider to be the right way on that by upholding the idea that Alabama needed to redraw its map and actually get, more representatives from those communities. There's a lot of conjecture that the reason the Supreme Court voted that way was because Dobbs was such a kind of bizarro aberration that they were looking to, politically not look as extremist as they have been.
Right.
But fortunately, it came out the right way in the Alabama case.
But the effect seems to have not happened, but it seems like Alabama is just ignoring
Yeah.
Supreme Court at this point.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's legitimacy conflict all the way down. It's great.
Yeah.
I don't want to pick on Illinois fourth too much. I'm from Chicago.
Hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing it.
No, you're not at all. You're completely right about the story. I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, maybe I'm asking for your personal opinion. Like a district like that is lauded by the Hispanic community is like, finally, we've got like one Hispanic congressperson. But in a lot of places, couldn't you draw those maps where like all the Congress people would be Hispanic? Or like there would be 0 white controlled districts. So it seems, so I guess it seems like it still winds up being like a, sorry for using the word, but like a hegemony on top, allowing a little bit of like the minimum viable amount of political power for anybody who's not already in power.
Yeah.
And like nobody wants to like completely, it doesn't seem like anybody wants to totally throw it up in the air and go, let's see where the chips fall. But like, is there a world where they just, it is all algorithmically driven, where there's, you know, kind of 0 partisan input?
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
And do you think that would be a good thing?
Oh.
Yeah.
Someone who's working in this space.
Yeah, I don't think, no, because one of the big changes that I didn't talk about was part of focusing on this issue, I think, has caused a lot of states to start to see that there's a kind of commission model for redistricting that's quite different from the legislature driven ones.
That's what we have in California.
Right. Yeah. I think California was kind of a leader in that. I think partially because I'm probably getting this history wrong, but partially because kind of the two parties had sort of fought each other to a bit of a stalemate. And then in the early 2000s, I think the Republican Party was like, man, we are just screwed in California forever unless we come up with some kind of way to do a, you know, fair looking non-legislative solution to this. Several states have passed different types of laws or citizen, what are they called, like propositions, in order to have what's called a commission drawing these maps. And the end result of those commissions typically is you've got somebody who's not the state legislature who's responsible for submitting maps. So in the state of California, for example, which has been doing this for well over a decade, that takes the form of citizens who are, there's like 15 of them or so. There's some requirements about like, you know, some number of them being Republicans, some number being Democrats, some number being independents. But what they do is they spend all their time going to different communities, you know, like a let's say Hispanic one, and saying, okay, like, is there a legitimately large, I don't know, Korean community in Los Angeles? Is it important for them to be able to elect a representative of their choosing? So they'll be looking for evidence of these communities and trying to figure out how to balance all that stuff. That's very different from what I think of as kind of a top-down view. Like when you look at North Carolina during the bad years of, you know, 2016, 2017, like that whole idea of community representation was just like, whatever, like that is a secondary concern. Our role here is we've got 13 seats and we want as many of them to be Republicans as possible. And whatever jiggling of boundaries we need to do to make that happen is what we're going to do. And so I think like if you talk to some of my colleagues who are a little bit smarter about this topic than I am, what they'll say is that what gerrymandering consists of is when you take all of these different, you know, potentially competing concerns and priorities and just put your finger on one of them and say, we're doing that one. So I think like, you know, the hegemony thing is like, okay, if you just decided that we were going to do everything by race and, you know, everything was going to turn it that way, that would also be a form of gerrymandering.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Thanks. Yeah. That helps me, you know, not want to be upset.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the commission thing has worked out pretty well. And there's a soft way to do it too. Like, you know, one of the ways in which I think I want to say Iowa maybe, or I forget the state, but it's like the commission comes up with the maps and then the legislature is still thumbs up, thumbs down on it. So they still ultimately have approval or not approval, but they're not drawing it. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the actual data that you collect to create the maps. My here and I are working on data right now, so it's on my brain. Is it easily accessible to get the data from the various states? Do you get any kind of pushback from states? Like, no, you can't have it right now, or excuses that it's not available?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. The data is always the hardest part of this. And when we were first starting, we were actually trying to collect this stuff ourselves. And so, for example, like a state like North Carolina, for as weird as it is actually kind of like top of the list in terms of making the best data public very aggressively. Other states aren't that way. What we ended up finding about midway through the project was that there was a project by Michael McDonald, is the VEST one that I mentioned, from University of Florida, where they were the ones actually doing that hard work. And so when we talked to them, what they were saying is, oh yeah, there's certain states that are very easy. They just publish their stuff. You ask for it. There's other states where we're like individually having to get on the phone with single county election officers in order to try to get data out of them. And what they're sending us is, faxes and other kinds of things. So which is kind of a nightmare. Fortunately, VEST has existed and has been like okay funded for the past couple of years. So literally everyone just relies on VEST in this world. The big worry that I have right now is they're always kind of on the edge of not having enough money. And so I've definitely written, a large number of these kind of, please give Mike money, not me, Mike, other Mike, please give VEST money in order to continue this project, because it only seems to get reliable funding during these kind of major years when everybody's eyes are on this. But it's also one of those like kind of low level like projects that you kind of have to keep churning. So yeah, I mean, broadly answering your question, like it's a super hard problem, but it hasn't been our super hard problem, thankfully.
It's interesting because what you've done is you flip that on its head and you're providing capacity for the analysis and sort of the expertise backed, data crunching and those with the community interest are bringing the data.
Yeah. One other element of the data, so that's all just for like election outcomes and precinct numbers. There's a whole other source of data that's about US Census, kind of American Community Survey, demographic information. Historically, that's been really good, but even there's fights about this stuff. Like that CVAP data, the citizen voting age data, I think has come under a lot of kind of political fire around, the Trump administration kind of wanting to ask if people were citizens, which is kind of a dangerous thing to ask on the census. I think the Census Bureau stopped publishing it for a couple of years. I'm not even currently up to speed on where it's at, but that's one that kind of comes and goes depending on the year. And is it available at a slightly lower resolution and lower spatial resolution than other forms of data? Yeah.
Thinking about data sources, do you incorporate kind of voting rates as part of like a factor that you can
like turnout, for example? Roughly speaking, yeah, it ends up going into the kind of the big model grinder. In early versions of the model, Eric was trying to get a lot of different factors in there. Race, education, turnout, all of that kind of stuff. I think once he went through a couple of iterations of it, he started to realize that a lot of those things kind of just like got factored out of the model. What he ended up doing was essentially looking at things at a kind of statewide basis. So we have kind of a very general model that just says, if you have this Clinton Trump vote or this Biden Trump vote, it leads to this kind of base number for what we think is going to happen legislatively. But then certain states will have kind of adjustments that go up and down. And so I think a lot of what you're describing kind of gets factored into like, oh, that state has really crappy turnout. But we won't look at like individual precincts turnout, for example.
So as I guess for follow-up, have you been running this long enough that you've been able to get back and fairly be able to refine what ways of your refined model?
Yeah, I think probably the big refinement has been trying to figure out if there's trying to figure out the role of the incumbency effect. And that a lot of the so for a lot of these places, like you might have a place that maybe went, Biden plus X points, but they still locally elect a Republican congressperson because like, oh, I know that guy and I knew his dad. And like there's a lot of those kind of like local kind of incumbency effects. I think one of the observations that led to the project in the first place was political scientists starting to see that perhaps incumbency effects were shrinking over time, that people really do vote kind of the national party rather than like the local representative whose name they've known. I think a lot of that observation came out of the 2010 cycle of getting all these kind of, Tea Party types. Suddenly it was like, oh, who are these folks? They've got no history here, yet they're getting elected on this kind of more national message. So I think we're definitely seeing kind of local effects that are shrinking with each election and people much more voting kind of national. It makes our math easier. It's not great.
question, just letting us know that chat is disabled. It's working, so there we go.
Okay.
Are there more questions from the room? All right. Yeah.
So I know in this cycle, there was a lot of, kind of like, civil society, organizations that were also in the advocacy work. As we was chatting with somebody from the Wellness Foundation. All of this union. I'm wondering, like, what's the professional Harvard statistician's opinions of that kind of advocacy work, and do they feel it's effective and worthwhile doing, or do they feel it's kind of amateurs getting up in the mix?
I think it's definitely not the latter.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's definitely not the latter. I think like Chris Warshaw in particular is really supportive. He's got kind of an academic interest. He's at George Washington University. His academic interest is really in that kind of local redistricting. So in what ways can like county level districts and supervisors be thought of relative to this model? I think kind of any situation where you have, local groups somehow advocating for representation is like broadly seen as a positive by the academic community here. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.